Claire had always thought of herself as someone who lived a steady, quiet life. She had moved into her little house in the suburbs years ago, seeking calm after too much rushing around in her younger days. Her neighbors, the Wilsons, had been good people, kind, dependable, the sort of family who waved when they saw you outside and offered to water your plants when you were away. Their son Ethan was much younger than Claire. She had watched him grow from a boy who used to ride his bike up and down the street into a tall, thoughtful young man who carried himself with a gentleness that set him apart. Though they weren't close, Claire always noticed his polite greetings and the way he sometimes lingered, as if wanting to say more but holding himself back. That Saturday afternoon was meant to be quiet. The sky was a soft gray, heavy with the promise of rain, and Claire had settled into her living room with a book and a mug of tea. She loved these slow days, when the world outside felt hushed, and she could lose herself in the comfort of solitude. The neighborhood itself was unusually still. The Wilsons had gone out of town, and many of the other families were busy with weekend errands. Claire assumed she would have the hours to herself. But the sound of the doorbell broke through her thoughts, sharp and unexpected. When she opened the door, Ethan stood there. He wasn't the awkward teenager she remembered from years ago. He looked different now, older, more sure of himself, though still carrying that quiet, reserved air. He held a small cardboard box in his hands, the kind that could have come from the post office, and offered her a nervous smile. "Hi, Claire," he said, his voice polite but carrying something else underneath it, a hesitation that made her wonder if he was uncertain about showing up. "I think this was delivered to our house by mistake." Claire blinked at the box before taking it. Sure enough, her name and address were written neatly across the label. She returned his smile. "Thank you, Ethan. I was wondering about this. I ordered something weeks ago." He nodded, shifting slightly on his feet. "No problem. I just thought I'd bring it over right away." There was a pause then, one of those moments where a simple exchange could have ended, where Ethan could have walked back to his house and Claire could have closed the door. But instead, Claire heard herself asking, "Would you like to come in for a moment? I was just making tea." She wasn't sure why she asked. Maybe it was politeness, or maybe it was the way he stood there, looking like he had more he wanted to say. Ethan's eyes brightened slightly and he nodded. "Sure, if it's not a bother." Inside, Claire led him into the living room. The air was warm with the faint scent of chamomile. Ethan sat on the edge of the sofa, hands resting loosely in his lap, while Claire poured him a cup of tea. She noticed how he looked around the room, not with judgment, but with quiet curiosity, as though taking in the details of her life. For a while, they talked about simple things, the weather, the neighborhood, how the Wilsons' dog always barked at passing cars. Claire found herself relaxing, surprised by how easy it was to talk to him. She had expected awkwardness, but instead there was a rhythm, a gentleness in his voice that made the conversation flow. Still, beneath it all, there was something else. Claire couldn't put her finger on it, but she felt it in the way Ethan's eyes lingered just a little too long when she spoke, in the way his tone softened when he said her name. It unsettled her, though not in a way that made her uncomfortable, more in a way that made her aware. Aware of herself, aware of him, aware of the unusual quiet that filled the house around them. The minutes slipped by faster than she realized. Claire caught herself studying him in the fading light coming through the window. He was no longer the boy she remembered running around the yard with scraped knees. He had grown into someone else, someone more complex, someone carrying a weight she hadn't noticed before. Ethan seemed to sense her thoughts, because after a pause he said quietly, "It feels strange being back here. I thought moving back after college would make things easier, but instead it feels emptier." He gave a small laugh, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Most of my friends are gone. My parents are busy. Sometimes I feel like I don't really belong anywhere anymore." The honesty in his words caught Claire off guard. She had expected polite conversation, not confessions. For a moment she didn't know what to say. But then she realized she understood him more than she expected. She too had felt that weight before, that loneliness that creeps in even when you're surrounded by people. "I know that feeling," she said softly. "When I first moved here, I thought I'd feel settled right away. But it took me a long time to feel like this was home. It's not easy when everything feels in between. Ethan looked at her then. Really looked. And for a fleeting second, Claire saw something vulnerable in his eyes. Something searching. It made her chest tighten in a way she hadn't felt in years. The rain finally began to fall outside, tapping against the window. The sound filled the silence between them, stretching it out. Claire sipped her tea, trying to steady herself. She didn't know why her heart was beating faster. It was only Ethan, her neighbor's son, sitting politely on her sofa. And yet, something about this quiet afternoon suddenly felt different, like a door had opened without her realizing it. Ethan placed his empty cup on the table and stood. "Thank you for the tea, Claire. I should probably head back before my mom calls to check in." Claire walked him to the door, her hand brushing lightly against the wooden frame as she hesitated. She wanted to say something, anything to break the strange weight in the air, but no words came. Instead, she simply smiled and said, "Thanks again for bringing the package." He smiled back, softer this time, and nodded. "Any time." And then he was gone, stepping into the rain with his hands tucked into his jacket pockets. Claire closed the door, leaning against it for a moment as the silence of the house wrapped around her again. But it wasn't the same silence as before. Something had shifted, something she didn't fully understand yet. And though she told herself it was nothing, deep down she knew this quiet afternoon would not leave her thoughts so easily. The rain had stopped by the next morning, leaving the streets washed clean and the air fresh. Claire tried to push away the memory of Ethan sitting in her living room, but it lingered like a shadow she couldn't shake. She went about her usual routine, watering her plants, folding laundry, brewing coffee, but every quiet moment seemed to carry the echo of his voice. She told herself it was silly. He had just stopped by with a package. That was all. Still, the way he had looked at her, the way his words had carried more weight than casual conversation, it unsettled her. 2 days later, as Claire was returning from the grocery store, she saw Ethan outside, leaning against the fence between their houses. He straightened when he noticed her, lifting a hand in greeting. "Hey, Claire, need help with those bags?" Before she could answer, he was already at her side, taking the heavier ones with ease. They walked together to her front porch, and though the moment was ordinary, Claire felt that same pull again. Once the groceries were set down, Ethan didn't immediately leave. He lingered, looking at her as though he wanted to say something but wasn't sure if he should. "Do you have a few minutes?" he asked finally. "I was hoping to talk." His tone was polite, but there was something urgent beneath it. Claire hesitated. She had things to do, dinner to prepare, a dozen small tasks waiting. Yet something in his expression made her nod. "Sure, come in." They settled again in her living room. This time Ethan seemed less guarded. He sat back, his long legs stretched out, his hands clasped together loosely. For a moment he was silent, as if collecting his thoughts. Then he began speaking, not in the light, casual way people usually do with neighbors, but with a raw honesty that surprised her. "It's strange being back here," he said. "When I was in college, I thought I'd come home, save some money, figure things out. But it feels empty. Everyone's moved on, and I feel like I'm stuck in the same place I left." Claire watched him carefully. His voice carried a weight she hadn't noticed before, like he'd been holding it in for too long. She sipped her tea slowly, giving him space to continue. "My parents are good people," Ethan said, "but they're busy with their own lives. My friends? Most of them live in other states now. When I walk around this neighborhood, I see the same houses, the same streets, but I don't feel like I belong anymore. It's like I'm waiting for something, but I don't know what." The words hung in the air. Claire felt a sudden pang of recognition. She knew that feeling all too well. The restlessness, the quiet ache of not knowing where you fit, the heavy silence of evenings when the world felt distant. She leaned forward slightly, her voice softer than she expected. "I understand. When I first moved here, I thought this house would feel like a fresh start, but for months, maybe even years, I felt like a guest in my own life. I kept waiting for the moment it would feel real. Sometimes it still doesn't." Ethan looked at her with something like relief. "Exactly. That's it. Everyone thinks I'm fine, but I'm not sure I am. I feel like I'm drifting." The honesty in his words touched something deep in her. Claire hadn't expected him to open up like this. He was younger, someone she had always thought of as the Wilsons' boy. But in this moment, he wasn't a boy. He was a young man carrying burdens of his own, speaking truths she remembered once carrying herself. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Claire felt the heaviness of the moment, the strange intimacy of two people sitting in the silence of an ordinary afternoon, yet sharing thoughts they had never voiced aloud before. Ethan gave a small laugh, though it didn't hide the weariness in his eyes. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to unload on you. I guess I just don't really talk to anyone about this stuff." Claire shook her head. "Don't apologize. Sometimes you just need someone to listen." He looked at her then. Really looked, as if he was seeing her in a way he hadn't before. Claire felt her breath catch under his gaze. It wasn't inappropriate or forward, just earnest, searching, almost grateful. Still, it made her pulse quicken. She quickly looked away, focusing on the steam curling from her mug. To steady the moment, she asked about his studies, his interests, what he hoped to do next. Ethan spoke more easily then, telling her about his passion for writing, the stories he wanted to create, the fear that none of it would be good enough. His words tumbled out in a rush, and Claire listened closely, nodding, asking questions. The more he spoke, the more she realized how much he longed to be understood. "You know," she said softly after a pause, "doubt never really goes away. But sometimes, what feels like being lost is just the first step toward finding the right path." Ethan's lips curved into a small smile. "Do you really think so?" "I do," Claire said. And she meant it. For a long while, they simply sat in the quiet that followed, the air between them charged in a way Claire didn't want to name. She was aware of every detail. The way the light from the window caught in his hair, the steady sound of the clock ticking, the warmth of the room compared to the cool dampness outside. She told herself it was only conversation, only a neighbor's son seeking advice. Yet the truth pressed in around her. There was more here, something unspoken, something she couldn't ignore. Finally, Ethan stood, his hand brushing against the arm of the sofa as though reluctant to leave. "Thanks, Claire. I don't know why, but it feels easier talking to you than to anyone else." His words stayed with her long after he had gone. Claire sat alone, her untouched tea cooling beside her, staring at the rain-streaked window. The house was quiet again, but it wasn't the same kind of quiet as before. It was heavier, filled with questions she didn't have answers for. She told herself not to think too much of it. Ethan was just lonely, reaching out because she had listened, but deep down she knew the truth. Something had changed between them. Something had shifted in a way she couldn't explain. And though she tried to brush it aside, the thought of his eyes, his words, his quiet honesty, they haunted her long into the night. The days that followed felt strangely unsettled for Claire. She went about her life as usual, work, errands, the quiet evenings with books and tea. But something had shifted. Ethan's words replayed in her mind, his voice carrying that mix of weariness and hope. She told herself she shouldn't think about it. He was simply her neighbor's son, a young man trying to find his place. Yet no matter how she tried, the memory of their conversation stayed with her, tugging at her thoughts at the most unexpected times. One late afternoon, she was sitting by her window, watching the sun sink low, when she saw Ethan outside again. He was standing near the fence, leaning against it with his head tilted back as though lost in thought. The golden light of the sunset cast a glow over him, softening the lines of his face. Claire hesitated before stepping outside. She told herself she was just being neighborly, but deep down she knew curiosity and something else, a pull she didn't want to name, was guiding her. "Enjoying the evening?" she asked lightly as she approached. Ethan looked up and smiled, that same quiet smile that seemed to say more than his words. "Yeah, just needed some air. Feels good out here." There was a pause, the kind of silence that didn't feel awkward, but instead carried weight, as if both of them were waiting for the other to speak. Claire gestured toward the small path that led down toward the lake at the edge of their street. "Want to walk for a bit?" He nodded, and they fell into step together. The world around them was calm. the sound of leaves rustling in the evening breeze, the faint hum of distant traffic. Neither spoke for a while. It wasn't uncomfortable. If anything, it felt natural, as though words weren't needed in that moment. When they reached the lake, the water shimmered with the last light of the day. They stopped by the edge, watching the ripples spread across the surface. Ethan's expression was thoughtful, almost distant. Claire glanced at him, and for a heartbeat, their eyes met. It was a simple glance, but it was enough to change everything. In that look, Claire saw something she hadn't expected, an intensity, a question, a feeling that mirrored her own unsettled thoughts. It wasn't the polite gaze of a neighbor, or the casual look of a friend. It was deeper, something that lingered even when their eyes finally pulled apart. Claire felt her chest tighten, her pulse quicken, and she immediately turned her gaze back to the lake. She tried to steady her breath, to remind herself this was Ethan, the boy who had once ridden his bike past her house with a backpack too big for his shoulders. But now, standing beside him, he wasn't that boy anymore. He was grown, with a quiet strength and a searching heart. The realization unsettled her. Ethan broke the silence first. Do you ever feel like life has these moments that change things? Small things, but somehow you know nothing will feel the same afterward? His words struck her. She wondered if he felt the same shift she did. She hesitated before answering, her voice steady but softer than usual. Yes. Sometimes it's not the big events, but the quiet moments you don't expect that stay with you forever. Ethan turned his head slightly, his eyes on her again. The golden light reflected in them, and Claire felt her breath catch. She wanted to look away, but she couldn't. That silent exchange stretched, filled with unspoken thoughts neither dared to voice. Finally, she tore her gaze from his and forced a small laugh. Listen to us. We sound far too serious for an evening walk. Ethan smiled faintly, but there was still something in his expression that lingered. Maybe. But sometimes serious is what we need. They walked back slowly, the air between them charged in a way Claire couldn't explain. Every step felt like it carried a weight, as though they were walking on the edge of something fragile and unspoken. When they reached her house, Ethan paused at the gate. He didn't move to go inside his own home. Instead, he lingered, his eyes on her as if he wanted to say something more. Claire felt the moment stretch, and with it came a rush of emotions. Curiosity, fear, a strange longing she hadn't expected. She smiled, keeping her voice light. Thanks for the walk, Ethan. It was nice. He nodded, but his eyes still held that same intensity. Yeah, it was. As he turned and walked away, Claire stood by her door, her heart racing. She leaned against the frame once she was inside, closing her eyes for a moment. That glance, those few seconds when their eyes had locked, haunted her more than she wanted to admit. The rest of the night, she tried to push it from her mind. She cooked dinner, watched the evening news, read a few pages of her book. But everything blurred together, because the only thing she could clearly see was Ethan's face in the fading light, the way his gaze had unsettled her. She wondered if she was imagining it, if maybe she was reading too much into a simple look, and yet her heart told her otherwise. The next morning, she woke early, the memory still fresh. As she sipped her coffee by the window, she saw Ethan again, this time jogging down the street. He caught sight of her and lifted a hand in greeting, his smile easy and warm. Claire raised her hand in return, but her chest ached with the reminder of that moment by the lake. She knew something had changed, though she couldn't yet put it into words. It was only a glance, only a silence shared between them, but sometimes that was enough. Enough to leave her restless, enough to leave her haunted, enough to make her wonder what would happen the next time they found themselves alone together. And though she told herself to stop thinking about it, to push it away, Claire knew the truth. That single glance had already begun to unravel her calm, steady life, and she wasn't sure if she wanted to resist it, or let it carry her somewhere new. Claire woke the next morning with a heaviness she couldn't name. She went through her usual routine, coffee, breakfast, straightening the house, but everything felt off. Her thoughts kept circling back to the evening walk by the lake, and the way Ethan's eyes had lingered on hers. It wasn't just a glance. It was something more. Something that unsettled her because she knew it wasn't only in her imagination. The silence between them had carried meaning, and that meaning refused to leave her alone. All day she carried the memory with her. While she folded laundry, she saw again the golden glow of the sunset on his face. While she tried to read, she felt the weight of his gaze, and when she tried to sleep, her heart wouldn't slow down, replaying the walk over and over. She told herself to stop thinking about it, that it was a simple moment, a harmless glance. But no matter how much she tried, she couldn't forget. Over the next few days, Claire saw Ethan only in passing. Once he was heading out for a jog, another time he was unloading groceries with his parents. Each time he gave her a smile or a small wave, and she responded in kind. On the surface, everything looked normal, yet every time their eyes met, Claire felt that same spark, quick and undeniable, as if a secret ran between them. It wasn't just attraction. It was something deeper, something she hadn't felt in years. He reminded her of youth, of restlessness, of a longing she had once known and buried beneath the routines of adulthood. The thought frightened her as much as it pulled her in. She was careful, telling herself not to encourage anything, but in the privacy of her thoughts, she admitted the truth. She couldn't stop wondering about him. One afternoon, she found herself outside tending her garden. The air was warm, heavy with the scent of summer, when she heard footsteps on the sidewalk. Ethan appeared, carrying a book in his hand. He stopped at the fence and leaned on it casually, his smile easy. "Hi, Claire," he said. "I was hoping I'd run into you. I just finished this book and thought you might like it." He held it out, and she recognized the title. It was a novel she had mentioned during their last conversation, one she had said she wanted to read but hadn't yet picked up. The small gesture touched her more than she expected. "Thank you," she said, taking it from him. "That's thoughtful." "It made me think of what you said about finding the right path," Ethan replied. "Some of the characters reminded me of that." They talked for a few minutes by the fence, and Claire felt her resolve slipping again. His presence was calm, but it stirred something inside her that refused to settle. When the conversation ended and he walked away, she stood there holding the book, her chest tight with emotions she didn't fully understand. That evening, she opened the book, but the words on the page blurred. Instead of following the story, she thought about Ethan, his voice, his quiet way of listening, the earnest look in his eyes. She remembered the lake, the glance that seemed to last longer than it should have. She remembered how, since then, her thoughts had been different, unsettled, restless. It wasn't long before she admitted to herself that the memory haunted her. She couldn't shake it. It had carved itself into her mind in a way she didn't know how to undo. She told herself it was dangerous to think this way, but the truth was undeniable. She was drawn to him, and the thought of pretending otherwise felt impossible. The following week, they crossed paths again at the grocery store. Claire was standing in line with a basket of produce when she felt a presence behind her. Turning, she found Ethan smiling, holding his own basket. "Guess we had the same idea," he said lightly. They laughed, and the sound felt too easy, too comfortable. They ended up walking home together, their bags in hand, their conversation flowing like it always did now. Claire found herself laughing more than she had in months. But beneath the lightness was that same quiet pull, the one that made her notice every brush of his arm, every glance that lingered just a second too long. When they reached her house, Ethan paused before continuing toward his. "Thanks for walking with me. It feels nice, like I'm not as alone." His words landed heavily in her chest. She wanted to say something back, something honest, but the right words wouldn't come. Instead, she just nodded, managing a small smile. "You're not alone, Ethan. Not really." He gave her a look then, one that carried far more than his words. And just like before, that glance stayed with her long after he was gone. That night, Claire sat by her window, staring out at the quiet street. The book he had given her rested on the table beside her, untouched. She couldn't focus on anything. All she could think about was the way her life felt different now. How one look, one conversation, had set something in motion that she couldn't control. She told herself it was wrong to dwell on it. She reminded herself of all the reasons to keep her distance. But reason had little power over memory. The truth was, Ethan had reached into a part of her she had thought long buried, a part that longed to be seen, to be understood, to feel alive again. The more she tried to push it aside, the more it returned, haunting her in the quiet moments of the day and the restless hours of the night. His voice, his gaze, the warmth of his presence, they followed her everywhere. Claire didn't know what would happen next, or even if anything should. But she knew this. What had passed between them was no small thing. It had left its mark, and she couldn't ignore it anymore. The memory wouldn't fade. It had changed her, and though she didn't yet know how, she knew it was only the beginning. Claire knew something had shifted, though she hadn't said it out loud to anyone. It wasn't just a glance, not just a conversation. It was a weight inside her chest, steady and inescapable. She told herself again and again to stop thinking about Ethan. But the truth was that her thoughts kept returning to him, no matter how hard she resisted. Days passed, and with each one, the feeling grew heavier. One Saturday morning, the sky was overcast, and rain tapped gently against the windows. Claire stayed inside, moving from room to room, restless. She tried cleaning, she tried reading, she even tried baking, but nothing worked. The air felt charged, as though the world itself was waiting for something. Then, a knock came at her door. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. When she opened it, Ethan stood there, rain dampening his jacket, his hair sticking to his forehead. He gave her a small smile, though his eyes carried something unspoken. "Sorry to bother you," he said softly. "The power just went out at my place. I thought maybe I could sit here for a while. It's pretty dark over there." Claire hesitated only for a second before stepping aside. "Of course. Come in." The living room glowed with the soft light of a single lamp. The rain outside had grown stronger, beating against the windows like 1,000 tiny drums. Ethan sat on the couch, rubbing his hands together for warmth. Claire brought him a blanket and a mug of tea. He accepted them with a quiet thank you, his smile faint but real. For a while they sat in silence, listening to the storm. The quiet wasn't uncomfortable. It was thick with unspoken things, a silence that spoke louder than words. Claire felt it pressing against her, urging her to acknowledge what she had been avoiding. Finally, Ethan broke it. "Claire," he said, his voice low, "do you ever feel like you're living a life that doesn't belong to you? Like you're waiting for something you can't even name?" His words struck her like lightning. She stared at him, her heart pounding. That was exactly how she felt, how she had been feeling for years. She swallowed hard, unsure how much to admit. "Yes," she whispered, "every single day." Their eyes met, and in that look, everything was clear. The restless longing, the quiet ache, the way both of them had been carrying something unspoken. It was all there, out in the open. For the first time, neither of them looked away. Ethan set his mug down, his expression steady but vulnerable. "I don't know what this is," he said carefully, "but I know it matters. More than I expected it to, more than I thought it could." Claire felt her chest tighten. She wanted to answer, but her voice caught. She wanted to say that she felt the same, that she had been haunted by every moment they shared. But fear held her back. Fear of what it meant. Fear of what would happen next. "I'm afraid," she admitted finally. "So am I," Ethan said. His honesty steadied her, but pretending isn't helping either of us. The storm outside grew louder, thunder rolling through the night. Claire felt the sound echo inside her. She realized then that this was the moment she couldn't run from. Whatever choice she made tonight would stay with her. Either she would hide from her feelings forever, or she would face them, no matter how uncertain the outcome. Slowly, she reached out and placed her hand over his. The simple touch felt like a confession, gentle but undeniable. Ethan's fingers tightened around hers, and neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The silence carried everything. Minutes passed like that. Two people sitting close, connected by something they couldn't explain but couldn't deny. Claire felt warmth spread through her, the kind she hadn't known in years. It wasn't about passion or impulse. It was about being seen, being understood, being alive again. When the storm finally began to ease, Ethan stood reluctantly. "I should go," he said, though his voice carried hesitation. Claire nodded, though her heart ached at the thought of him leaving. She walked him to the door, the air between them heavy with all they hadn't said. Just before stepping outside, he paused and turned back to her. "Claire," he said, his gaze holding hers. "Whatever this is, I don't want to forget it, even if nothing more happens. Even if it stays just this. I'll carry it with me." Tears stung her eyes, but she managed a small, trembling smile. "So will I." He gave her one last look before disappearing into the night. When the door closed, Claire leaned against it, her heart racing. The house felt quiet, too quiet. Yet something inside her had shifted. She knew life wouldn't simply return to what it was before. The memory of Ethan, the connection they shared, the truth they both admitted, it would stay with her always. That night, she finally slept deeply, though her dreams were filled with images of rain, of laughter, of glances that spoke more than words. She didn't know where the future would take either of them, but she knew this. The bond they discovered, though fragile and uncertain, had given her back something she thought she'd lost forever. It wasn't a perfect ending. It wasn't simple, but it was real, and in its own quiet way, it was enough. The story of her and Ethan wouldn't be one she told others, not openly. But in her heart, it would always remain, a haunting, tender memory of the time she wasn't alone, the time someone truly saw her. And though it might fade from the world outside, inside her it would never disappear. It would live as a reminder that love, even the quiet kind, had the power to change everything.